Chapter 17. Former Labour British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, has said that the Bush administration knew there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq while they were telling the world that there were. This is a quote by David Icke in The Perception Deception. The reporting in July of 2016 of the Chilcot report on the UK version of Yahoo News was very interesting, just as interesting as watching a liar, squirming uncomfortably in front of a worldwide media, seemingly on trial. Mr. Blair should consider an acting career. This decision that he made will forever tarnish his reputation to stand shoulder to shoulder with another buffoon named George Bush, after the 11th of September attacks in New York. As Yahoo News put it, it was an essential demonstration of solidarity with the UK's principal ally. After a 7-year process, the Chilcot report was published and its evaluation was damning, and to be honest, it made me embarrassed to be a British citizen. The UK betrayed its commitment to international law, its system of government scrutiny and its duty to the British public, its armed forces and British citizens around the world. What about the people who live in countries in which it has no right to be there but interferes just as America does so? The British public that votes parties into government in order to represent them, supposedly. Of course, there are countless examples of political parties promising this and that before getting into power, only to see such potential policies thrown out of the window only a few months down the line after gaining the power of the nation. According to reporter Ian Dunt, Blair did try to prevent unilateral United States action and keep the international community together, and he had some success. He quotes the main villains as being George Bush and the arrogant advisers around him, and it's hard to disagree, but Blair is still implicated and still cannot be excused. The Chilcot report found that Blair's efforts to ally with the US were compromised from the start because British legal advice could not support the US with regime change, so Blair could only aim at the disarming of Iraq. Chilcot found that in December 2001, Blair wasn't committed to military action, but he was committed to steps which made intervention possible. By February 2002, Blair had found out that Bush had been talking to General Tommy Franks to review military operations for removing Saddam, including a ground invasion. By July of that year, he was sure that the US had decided on military action, and it was only really now a case of how and when. Blair wrote a note to Bush saying, "I will be with you, whatever." Britain then tried to get the United Nations on board by constructing an ambiguous resolution along the lines of non-compliance from Iraq, which would trigger action and what that action would be. The UN route worked and Iraq complied with the resolution, meaning that inspectors could then snoop around. Hans Blick soon realized that perhaps there was not much WMDs in Iraq after all. The US had limited patience even though Iraq said they had no WMD program. The Foreign Secretary at the time for Britain, Jack Straw, commented that if it continued with this obvious falsehood, it was rejecting peace. The Americans wanted a war, and so it then happened, as both Britain and America had tried to invent a legal case for a war, and when that didn't happen they both went ahead anyway, costing the lives of many of the force's personnel as well as many innocent civilians. The lunatics running the asylum, Attorney General Lord Goldsmith, held a view that a second UN resolution was needed to make war legal, and the advice was only seen by those in number 10 Downing Street. And in March it was suddenly concluded that war was now legal as Iraq was in breach of Resolution 1441. Early on, Blair had promised the US that the UK would take a significant military role, but made no decisions on what kind of military package would be offered. Warnings that Blair received from experts, committees, foreign leaders and protesters showed that the war would be a disaster. British forces entered Basra without instructions to maintain the peace with no rules of engagement, so there was lawlessness and looting. This then spread around the country. The Americans dismantled the country and there were food, water and power shortages which ruined the relationship between the armed forces and the Iraqi population. The Chilcot report found that there was the same absence of thought exercise before the war as during it, and that no substantial change in approach was ever implemented. A candid reappraisal of policies did not take place. There also was a lack of preparation by Blair because the British forces were already stretched in the Afghanistan war, and that the soldiers fighting in the Iraq war had serious equipment shortages, particularly in combating IEDs, as well as intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance and helicopter support. Ian Dunt commented that the repercussions of it are so severe, the number of lives lost so extensive, that his reputation should never recover. The Chilcot report is one of the most damning assessments ever made of a British Prime Minister. Here. According to Sky News on the 6th of July, 2016, Tony Blair had said that he will never accept that servicemen and women who were killed or injured in the Iraq War made their sacrifice in vain. He described the decision to launch military action as the hardest, most momentous and agonizing decision I took in my 10 years as the British Prime Minister. At the Worldwide News Conference, battling back the crocodile tears, he said that the intelligence assessments at the time of going to war, the aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted and bloody than even we imagined. I express more sorrow, regrets and apology than you may ever know or can believe. The decisions I made I have carried with me for 13 years and will do so for the rest of my days. There will not be a day of my life where I do not relive and rethink what happened. Amazingly, Blair also told Sky reporter Adam Bolton that he could look the nation in the eye and say that he did not mislead them. What I cannot do and will not do is say that I believe we took the wrong decision. I believe that I made the right decision and that the world is better and safer as a result of it. You couldn't make it up. They're words of a true psychopath. Blair also added that he accepted full responsibility for the criticisms made by the Iraq inquiry, even where he didn't agree with them. Unfortunately, the Chilcot report is not legally binding and is only an analysis from a former civil servant. Even more amazingly, after the war, Blair was crowned a Middle East peace envoy as well as Philanthropist of the Year by GQ magazine for his tireless charitable work. He was later awarded the Save the Children's Global Legacy Award at a gala charity at the Plaza in New York. Just as incredible is the fact that prosecutors at the International Criminal Court will look through a 2.3 million word report for potential war crimes committed by the Allied forces soldiers, not the men who put the soldiers into the situation of war. This could only happen in the lunatic asylum which is planet Earth. I always get that crawling sensation on my skin when I hear about the noble troops defending our freedoms, as if our freedoms were ever challenged by anyone but bankers and politicians, who send them out to die in place of themselves. This is a quote by Levisable.